Somehow, we are already a fourth of the way through 2025, which blows my mind. Time just flies so fast. And now we're at the point where I'm thinking back on what I've read so far this year. I know a lot of people do quarterly reading wrap ups, uh, but reading wrap ups in general don't particularly interest me. I'm more curious about what people are DNFing because while what you read says a lot about your taste, I think what you DNF can also comment on what your interests are. And it got me thinking about what I've DNF'd this year. I've had a pretty good reading year. I would say I've had a lot of 3.5 to 5 star reads because typically, if I think a book is going to be a 2 to a 1 star, I won't finish it. I thought it'd be fun to quickly go over them, talk about them just a little bit in detail, and maybe why I decided they didn't work for me or why I wanted to put them aside for the time being. So, with that, I'm going to be talking about the 14 books I DNF'd in the first 4 months of 2025. So, if I did my math right, I DNF'd 3 books in January, 2 in February, 3 in March, and then, wait for it, 7 in April. Yeah. April was not the best reading month, but the books that I did finish, I liked a lot. Starting off, the first book that I DNF'd is Challenger by Adam Higginbotham. This is a nonfiction book that follows the events preceding and following the Challenger disaster and everything that was going on behind the scenes at NASA and with different individuals that led to the explosion of the shuttle. I'm a really big fan of the Challenger Netflix documentary and I've watched it multiple times. And I'm always curious to know more, so that's why I ultimately picked this book up, hoping that there would be some information I wasn't familiar with. And that was definitely the case, but ultimately I found myself just kind of bored, honestly. There were a lot of people discussed in this book, which makes sense, but it was hard to differentiate between them. On top of that, I thought the writing was a little bit long winded. As a result, I did find that it was a little confusing at times, especially when all of the engineering and scientific terms were being discussed, because I felt like there was so much that was going over my head. I made it maybe like 25% into this before I decided to shelve it and stick with the documentary that I've watched previously. Next up in January, I DNF'd Bad Cree by Jessica Johns. This is actually a buddy read that a friend of mine and I decided to pick up together. And I felt so bad because I didn't like what I read at all. I struggled so much with this book. I tried listening to it on audio, I tried reading it on ebook, and nothing really worked for me. I found it just kind of boring. And that's going to be a big running theme, is that I get bored with a lot of the books I DNF, and that's ultimately why I drop them. However, this one does have a really interesting setup. It's dealing with indigenous horror and dreams and dream walking and Wendigo? How do you say that? I've watched Supernatural too much. Wendigo. That's how you say it. But yes, I really like the mythology and the culture that's being explored in this book. But again, I was bored. I found the main character Mackenzie to be a very lackluster protagonist. I had a hard time empathizing with her, even though I did like this concept of badness and how she feels that she is sort of failing at being Cree and failing her family as a result of that. One of the biggest issues that I did have with this book were the time jumps, because we'd be in the present day and then Mackenzie would start telling a story that would cover 3, 4, 5 pages that takes place in the past when she was a child or a teenager. And then all of a sudden we're back in the present. So to me, the transitions really didn't work very well. And as a result, the momentum of the actual story was lost. Going in an entirely different direction, I DNF'd The Catcher in the Rye by J.D. Salinger. I will not lie, I picked this up because Salinger's work plays such a role in the manga and anime Banana Fish. That's where the title actually comes from, is one of his short stories. And I've always heard The Catcher in the Rye is this excellent classic. Either you love it or you hate it, and I think it's all because of the main character, Holden. And I will say I found Holden infuriating, but that's not surprising because he's a teenager, and teenagers are infuriating often. There wasn't anything that I found like extremely bad about this book or offensive, although it is of its time, so go in knowing that there are going to be a lot of outdated comments about women and race and class. The reason I decided to put it down was just, again, I was bored. I didn't think it was going to be a book that stuck with me or that I wanted to add to my collection. Back with another nonfiction book, I have Pathogenesis by Jonathan Kennedy. Pathogenesis is exploring the history of humanity through various different plagues and how these plagues ultimately contributed to societies being established, falling, and developing. I read a good portion of this. I know it was over half of it and liked what I read, but there was at one point I finally got to a chapter and I don't even remember what it was about. I think it was very like British centered, like Eurocentric. I really lost the desire to keep going because something I'd like been thinking in the back of my head the whole time kind of came to the forefront at that point, and I realized that this is a very Eurocentric exploration of these plagues and human history, which is always so unfortunate because the world has so many different cultures and so many cultures that aren't explored in, traditional publishing often. I really wanted to get more of how these plagues affected civilization in Asia, a little bit more in Africa, in Australia, but we don't get a lot of that. And it makes sense because the author is European, so he's looking at it through a very specific lens. But it's not a lens I'm interested in. I got to the point where I felt like I learned all that I needed to know and was able to pass this on to a better home. This next book is kind of interesting because I actually DNF'd it twice, and that is Bright Young Women by Jessica Knoll. Unlike a lot of people, I like learning about true crime, but I find recently that the staples of true crime, including Ted Bundy, they've been talked to death, and I don't think there's anything really new to be said or that should be said about them. And so when this book was announced and I found out about it and that it was focusing on the victims of him, I was really interested in it. I picked it up last year from the library and read maybe 50 pages before I was like, it's just not the right time. I'm liking this, but I'm not in the right mindset for it. So I put it aside. And then recently in February, I was like, I want to read this again. I want to give it another shot. And I gave it a good shot. I probably, like with Pathogenesis, read about half of it before I started feeling kind of like icky about it. And the reason I say that is because there are different points in the book where the author is talking about, the defendant who is nameless in the book, which I really did like. But the way that so many people put him on a pedestal, they make these documentaries and books about him, and they're not focusing on the victims, which is all very true. What kind of rubbed me the wrong way is that I feel like this book also does that to an extent. And I know that was not the author's intention, but I found myself in kind of like a weird situation where I liked parts of what she was doing, but on the whole, I was like ethically, morally, I don't feel comfortable reading this, especially because there were certain parts of the book where she would have characters recounting certain things that the defendant had done. And I kid you not, it read word for word like something you would hear on a podcast or a documentary. And that's where I kind of had to draw the line. And while the writing was decent, there was nothing offensive I found about it, it just didn't do anything for me. And writing is such an important part of reading that I didn't want to continue investing my time in a book that the prose wasn't really clicking with me, and neither was the story. I have never read anything by Naomi Novik. I've heard her receive a lot of love and attention, but the only book of hers so far that has interested me is His Majesty's Dragon. I can't honestly remember how I came across this. I just know it was in a fanfic where someone was kind of drawing on the way that humans bond with dragons, and I was curious about that because I like the idea of that, and I was underwhelmed, unfortunately. I don't think Novik's writing did much for me, kind of like the writing in Bright Young Women. It was fine, but I didn't get anything out of it, except for the fact that she uses way too many semicolons. At least in this book she did. It was like egregious use of semicolons. I'm talking like 3 to 4 on a Kindle page. I know this is a small thing, but as someone who loves semicolons with her whole heart, it really did bother me after a while. I also was having a hard time differentiating between the characters because to me they all sounded the same. I know it's building up to a series, but this first book really did not pull me in and convince me that I needed to read the next book or even finish this one. I like the idea of these countries using dragons in their militaries and wars. I just wish it had been better fleshed out, like how these relationships first came into being. I will say I loved the relationship between the dragon rider and the dragon. I can't remember the names right now. That's how little impact this had on me. But I really did like their relationship. It was a little quick in the sense that the dragon rider was very reluctant at first to be paired with this dragon. And very quickly he got over that. I wanted to see more of them actually building a relationship. But I do still have this on my Kindle in case I ever decide to come back to it one day. This next book might be the most disappointing DNF, and that is Dark Star Burning, Ash Falls White by Amelie Wenzhou. I read Song of Silver Flame Like Night, and despite it being tropey and cliched and the writing being repetitive at times, I really did enjoy it. I thought it was setting up very nicely this interesting world of cultivators and Chinese-inspired magic. The note it ended on was good for a sequel, and so I was really interested in seeing how some of the relationships that were teased in the first book could be developed, and we'd see secondary characters really flourish, and also just how the plot would resolve. And I realized very quickly, I'm talking like 3 or 4 chapters, that this book was going to be entirely different. It felt rushed. There wasn't a lot of breathing space for characters to actually talk and interact and for us to see them grow into themselves. I found that the author was just trying to get from like point A to B to C as quickly as possible. And partly, this is a shorter book than the first one. She had the space to really expand the world and the characters and what was going on. And I just found it unfortunate that she didn't. After that, we then have Sinful Crimes for the Artistically Inclined by W.H. Lockwood. I picked this up because it sounded like Supernatural but queer. And I was all for that. I was all for it, really excited. And it was just... This is probably the hardest book for me to talk about because there were aspects of it that I genuinely did enjoy. But so many of the writing choices were just not for me. This book is following 2 men who have a fast-burn relationship. We actually see them get together really early on, but they've known each other a couple of months in advance. I was fine with that. What I wanted was to actually get more of how they did meet and see that maybe through some flashbacks or some introspection. We got none of that. Instead, we were just told how they met. And I think that's the biggest downside to this book, is that everything is told to the reader. You don't actually see the characters falling in love and dealing with trauma. You're just told about that trauma and the feelings they have for one another. And the sad thing is, like, the main characters had a really good dynamic. I liked their banter. I liked the fact that they were so, like, ride or die for each other after only knowing one another a short period of time. There were a lot of things that were actually touched on and alluded to that made this a really interesting world of different spirits and monsters and art theft. Like, it was a really cool setup, but nothing was done with it, or not enough was done with it. And partly it could be because I didn't realize in this until after I started reading, is that this duology is a spin-off to a trilogy. So I'm assuming one of the pivotal moments that is mentioned in this book actually happened in that trilogy. But I was not compelled to read that to have these events make more sense. And I don't think you should have to. I think even if something is a spinoff, it should be able to stand on its own and work well. Finally, getting to the books I own, we have God Killer by Hannah Kenner. I've had this for a while and thought it sounded like it would be right up my alley. We have these different gods and people who are paid to kill them. But it was like, as I was reading it, and the little bit that I did read, I found the gods and the mythology behind them fascinating. It was really cool. I also liked the queer and disability rep we saw, and the way that you could see these characters coming together and how a sort of found family was going to be established. My problem, though, is not a problem with the book. It's just, I don't think I was in the right mindset for this. I was kind of going through a reading slump in April, hence why I DNF 7 books. But I wasn't really compelled by the story. And from what I've heard of the other books and where they go, I don't think I would have loved it. Again, nothing wrong with it. I think this is going to work for a lot of people, but for me, at least right now, it didn't. Another book that I'm kind of sad to have DNF'd is The Enchanted April by Elizabeth von Arnim. I read half of this and was absolutely in love. The premise of these 4 women leaving their humdrum lives and the men in their lives and going to stay in this Italian castle. Loved it. Girl, go. Loved it so much. And I liked the humor of these women interacting with each other and like being annoyed and confused with one another, and how this change of scenery and change of pace and company was really influencing them and affecting them for the better. I love that. And then Von Arnim decided halfway through, no, I do need to bring the husbands into the book. What really disappointed me with this is that the changes that the women were starting to slowly experience, they only came to fruition when the men arrived at the castle. And it was sort of like the message was that you can only be happy as a woman if you have a man in your life. And as an Aero Ace individual, I found that like very disheartening. And I had maybe 30 pages to go, but I just didn't care anymore. This next book is the only one I would say is a softie enough, and that is Man-Made Monsters by Andrea L. Rogers. One of my dear friends got this for me for Christmas, and I believe I had heard of it. I'd seen the cover at least, and I was familiar with the publisher, but I didn't really know much about it except for that it was a short story collection. And then as I got into it, I realized that the stories are actually interconnected, which always is something I'm interested in. I love that sense of being able to tie these different perspectives and lives together and have a story stand on its own, but also function as a whole. Indigenous horror is growing in publishing. We're seeing more of that. And so I was really excited to try this out. And I will say, like, I didn't dislike this, but I found it a little bit underwhelming. Some of it was because of the writing, some of it was because of different stylistic choices in how the stories were told. But I ultimately decided that as much as I was liking certain aspects of it, I didn't feel compelled to finish it at this point, at least. I've got about like a fourth left. So if I ever do feel like coming back to it, I'm going to hold on to this and maybe give it another shot. Going in a different direction from Indigenous horror, we have poetry, and that is Glitter Road by January Nil O'Gill. January Gill O'Neill. I came across this randomly at one of my indie bookshops and fell in love with the cover, this map of the Mississippi River and the gold throughout. But then I also read a little bit of the poems and the back and what was being discussed, and there's so much that really resonates with me as someone who does live in Mississippi, who lives in the Deep South, where there is still so much racism and the scars of racism exist and we see them every day. O'Neill talks about that a lot in her poems, and I really enjoyed that aspect of her work. I also thought like the way that she handled line breaks and where lines ended was really powerful. It's kind of hard to explain unless you're actually looking at the poem, but that really struck me. I did start thinking, though, that some of the poems were very repetitive. Certain themes she came back to again and again, and not so much in like a new, different way. It was always sort of the same, it felt like. And I kind of just, after a while, was like, I think I've read enough. I don't need to read anymore. I've gotten all I'm going to out of this. And that's okay, because not every poem in every collection is going to be a banger. But as long as you find some that you do really like, that's what's important to me. After that, I DNF'd The Boy Who Steals Houses by C.G. Drews. Now, I read this author's, I guess more like traditional American debut, Don't Let the Forest In, last fall. And at the time, like, I gave it 3 stars. I liked it, but I had some critiques. And yet I found myself still thinking about it a lot. But I was curious about her work. I'm curious about her upcoming book. And then I was curious about this, which was her debut. And I think this does have a lot of merit. It's looking at messy family relationships and being kind to one another, and the fact that you can't be what everyone needs you to be. I liked what we saw of the relationship between Sammy and Avery. And I liked the dynamics of the family that Sammy kind of ends up like infiltrating, if you will. But nothing really clicked with me in the sense that, oh, I need to keep reading. I need to see what happens. I actually ended up skimming this, and again, I think it would be a good book for a lot of people, but it really, I don't know, it didn't really resonate with me in the way that I'd hoped it would. However, I do like a lot of the author's writing choices, the way that she approaches sentences and sometimes does unconventional things. I really like how encouraging she is of promoting autistic voices and disabled voices and showing the multifaceted nature of individuals with autism. Even though this particular book wasn't a hit for me, I do plan on trying out more from this author in the future. And then the last book. I know I said previously that The Enchanted April might have been my most disappointing read, or DNF. No, that's not true, because I DNF'd Murder by Cheesecake by Rachel Ekstrom Courage. I am a Golden Girls fan through and through. I love it with my whole heart. It had a huge influence on my childhood and continues to influence me as an adult today. And so when this book was announced, I knew I was going to at least give it a shot, even though I don't really like mystery. But I picked this up. My sister did as well. We were going to buddy read it together. And I went into it with low expectations because the Golden Girls, the writing of the show was so witty and sharp and so of its time. And so I wasn't sure how a 21st century author was going to translate that into a novel. And unfortunately for me, it did not translate well. The characters didn't really feel like themselves. Honestly, Dorothy was way too nice. The humor that was there kind of fell flat for me. There were one or two moments where I did kind of chuckle, but I didn't really find it snappy. I didn't find it wholesome in the sense that the Golden Girls, does touch my heart. It felt like a bad impression of the series, and I made the decision to not finish it because I knew I wasn't going to enjoy it, and I didn't want it affecting my love for the show. But yes, those are the 14 books I have DNF'd so far. I wouldn't mind maybe doing like a part 2 to this after August, and then maybe a part 3 the end of December, beginning of next January. But I'll just see how many more books I DNF if I have enough to talk about, which I'm sure I will, because I do DNF quite a lot.